Research focuses on the economic development of cities and regions with a special interest in the developing world. In the past, he was a consultant with the German Technical Cooperation Agency in Ecuador, where he advised local and provincial governments on economic development policies. He also held teaching positions at 3 Ecuadorian universities and has served as teaching fellow and summer instructor in economics and statistics at Harvard Kennedy School since 2010.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite our panelist, Professor Stephen Levitsky and Professor Candelaria Garay, please to step. So let me begin by introducing our panelists and not take too much time from their time. So we're very happy to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. Professor Stephen Levitsky is a Harvard College professor and professor of government at Harvard University. His research includes political parties, political regimes, and regime changes and weak informal institutions with a special focus in Latin America. He's author of a number of publications, including Transformer Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism in Comparative Perspective. He's co-author of Comparative Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, and co-editor of Argentine Democracy, The Politics of Institutional Weakness, Informal Institutions and Democracy, Lessons from Latin America, and The Resurgence of the Latin American Left in Latin America. He is currently writing a book on the durability of revolutionary regimes and co-editing a book on the challenges of party building in Latin America. Professor Levitsky writes a regular column in the Peruvian newspapers La República. Professor Garay is an assistant professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government. She focuses her research on social policy, collective action, and party politics in Latin America. She receives a PhD and MA in political science from the University of California at Berkeley. Both of our speakers are Berkeley grads. Beautiful campus.
I'm off to Berkeley.
She holds a BA in sociology from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Currently, she's working on a book manuscript that she seeks to characterize and explain the recent expansion and cross-country variation in social programs, in social policy programs, including income transfer, pension, healthcare services, to populations historically excluded from social protection in the region, in Latin America. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll start with Professor Levitsky.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Okay. And in English, right?
Yes.
Okay. And how do I, am I okay with microphone? You can hear me? I think you can. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is really exciting. I know nothing about Ecuador, but hopefully I'll learn something. I do want to talk, what? The only thing I know about Ecuador is the time I spent in the, and you have a great New Year in Quito. That great time. I want to talk about the left and democracy in Latin America and try to put Ecuador a little bit in comparative perspective. As you know, in the U.S. establishment, we tend to divide the Latin American left into the good left and the bad left, the good left being the sort of moderate, liberal, democratic left in Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay. And the bad left, the so-called bad left, is the more radical, nationalistic, plebiscitarian left in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, maybe Argentina. This second left is said to be bad in at least two senses. Economically, it's said to repeat many of the failed statist policies of the past, and politically, it's said to threaten democracy. I think this is inaccurate and that it's misleading. Only Venezuela, in my view, comes even close to meeting this caricature of the bad left. In terms of economic policy, Venezuela may have embarked on a sort of unsustainable statist project, but Ecuador and Bolivia clearly have not. For the most part, the Morales and Correa governments have been fiscally prudent. They've kept inflation down. Their economies are growing. And in terms of politics, democracy may well have broken down in Venezuela, But in Bolivia and Ecuador, the story is much, much more complicated. Neither Bolivia nor Ecuador was stably or fully democratic before the left came to power. During the 1980s and 90s, a time when the international community lauded Bolivian democracy, governments imposed states of siege. Governments arrested scores of union leaders. During the crisis of the early 2000s in Bolivia, protests were met with severe repression. At least 60 people were killed during the so-called gas war of 2003. In Ecuador, there were serious human rights violations under the government of Febres Cordero in the 1980s. President Bucaram was illegally removed from power in 1997. President Mahuad was overthrown in a coup in 2000. President Gutierrez fell in 2005 after committing a series of abuses, including packing the Supreme Court. So the idea that Morales and Correa, their governments, have undermined democracy is based on a misrepresentation of what existed before. What existed before in Bolivia and in Ecuador was not Costa Rica. These were countries with very, very weak and frequently violated democratic institutions. Democratic procedure was repeatedly violated in Ecuador in the 20 years prior to Correa. Civil liberties and even human rights were repeatedly violated in Bolivia prior to Morales. So although Morales and Correa are no angels, and I'll get back to this, the Bolivian and Ecuadorian regimes today are not markedly less democratic than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So I think this good left versus bad left distinction is badly misleading. I think it's more accurate, and this is what I want to focus on, to describe Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela in different ways as cases of populism. I don't mean populism in a pejorative sense. By populism, I mean the mobilization of lower-class constituencies, usually by a personalistic leader, a personalistic outsider, against the entire political and economic elite. Populists are outsiders who mobilize the poor against the entire establishment, trashing the elite and existing institutions as corrupt, as oligarchic, as unrepresentative, and promising to sweep them away, usually in the name of a more authentic democracy. Now, gringos have trouble, a lot of trouble with populism, because populism is neither unambiguously good nor unambiguously bad for democracy. It is both good and bad for democracy. In other words, populism's consequences for democracy are almost invariably double-edged. Let me talk about that briefly. On the one hand, populism is almost always inclusionary. Populists emerge where democracies are failing to represent the poor. Populists mobilize voters around the idea that the existing political elite does not represent them, that it excludes them, that has systematically screwed them over. That kind of appeal only succeeds when it has some basis in reality, where a large number of voters, in fact, perceive themselves to be politically, economically, socially, often racially excluded, marginalized. Now, successful populists, when they come to power, bring a wrecking ball to the old elite. They throw out the old political elite, and they generally replace it with a new elite that is more open and that is more inclusionary. Classic populists like Perón incorporated the working classes into politics, placing union leaders into positions of political power for the first time. Evo Morales empowered Bolivia's indigenous communities, bringing indigenous and other popular sector leaders into positions of power, in some cases for the first time. Even Fujimori in Peru, who's more of a right-wing populist, created a much more inclusionary elite, bringing more mestizos, more provincianos, more women into political positions of power. My wife is a Peruvian journalist. She said that before Fujimori, she would walk into Congress and it would be like walking into another country, a room filled with wealthy white men. That changed considerably under Fujimori. As one pro-Fujimori congressman put it, told my wife back in the 1990s, and I quote him, "The members of the Democratic opposition are the ones who have always held power. With Fujimori, people like me are in Congress. The opposition would never have allowed me into their ranks because I'm not like them. I'm not white, I'm not from Lima, and I don't have money." So populism is inclusionary in the sense that previously excluded sectors are given greater access to the centers of power. And that inclusion can have a real impact on democracy. In both Bolivia and in Ecuador, satisfaction with democracy, if you look at public opinion polls, satisfaction with democracy has increased markedly over the last few years. In Bolivia, in 2004, a year before Evo Morales' election, the Latino Barometer survey found that 16% of Bolivians were satisfied with their democracy. In 2009, 4 years into Morales' presidency, 49% of Bolivians said they were satisfied with their democracy, triple what it had been in 2004. In Ecuador, in 2005, a year before Correa's election, 14% of Ecuadorians said they were satisfied with the democracy. In 2011, a couple years ago, 50% of Ecuadorians said they were satisfied with the democracy, nearly 4 times as high as in 2005. These improvements are not an accident. They are a product of governments that are widely perceived to be more inclusionary and more representative than their predecessors. But at the same time, populism tends to undermine liberal democracy. In fact, it often gives rise to what I call competitive authoritarianism. Competitive authoritarianism is a civilian political regime in which elections and democratic institutions exist, are meaningful, but in which incumbent abuse of state institutions so skews the playing field that the opposition's ability to compete is compromised. So unlike full-scale dictatorships, unlike the military regimes we saw in Latin America in the 70s, these are, in fact, competitive regimes. Opposition parties are legal, they're above ground, and they use democratic institutions to contest vigorously for power. Elections are often bitterly fought-out contests in which incumbents really have to sweat it out. Sometimes incumbents even lose. But what distinguishes competitive authoritarianism from democracy, from full democracy, is that competition isn't fair. Elections may be marred by a certain amount of manipulation, even fraud. Journalists, opposition leaders, human rights activists may be harassed, may be arrested. And crucially, most importantly, the political playing field is uneven. Incumbents abuse the state. They abuse state resources. They raid the state treasury. They deploy armies of public employees for election campaigns. They politicize state institutions like the courts, the police, the tax authorities, and use them as weapons against the opposition. So soldiers and police work for the governing party. Intelligence agencies spy on the opposition. Tax authorities investigate and punish businesses that finance opposition. And the courts are used to convict newspaper editors, journalists, even cartoonists of libel or defamation. Over time, businesses stop financing opposition, the media start to censor themselves due to fear of retribution. And as a result, the political playing field becomes increasingly skewed against the opposition. Access to resources is skewed. Access to the media is skewed. And eventually, the incumbents' advantages in terms of access, particularly to resources and media, become so excessive that it seriously affects the opposition's ability to compete. To quote Mexican analyst Jorge Castaneda, writing about Mexico in the 1990s, it's like, and I quote, a soccer match where the goalposts are of different heights and breadths, and where one team has 11 players plus the arbitro, the referee, and the other team has a mere 6 or 7 players. Cases of competitive authoritarianism include Argentina back under Perón, include Mexico under the PRI, particularly in the 80s and 90s, Peru under Fujimori, Venezuela under Chavez and now Maduro, and although there are milder cases, I would argue Bolivia and Ecuador today. I want to suggest that there is a link between populism and competitive authoritarianism, between successful populism and competitive authoritarianism. Populism contributes to competitive authoritarianism in a couple of ways. First of all, populists, and less important, populists are outsiders. And outsiders very often lack a strong commitment to the institutions of representative democracy. Whatever you may think of traditional or career politicians, and I know many of us don't think very highly of traditional or career politicians, those guys, most of them are at least minimally committed to working within representative democratic institutions. They've generally spent their careers working within representative democratic institutions. They're experienced with the nuts and bolts of democratic politics, things like negotiation, coalition building. They know how to achieve their goals through those institutions. They know how to get bills through Congress. They know how to work the courts. And they tend to have a stake in the preservation of those institutions because it's their livelihood. It's what they do. It's what their whole career is based on. With political outsiders, it's more of a crapshoot, an asar. Outsiders are political amateurs. That means they've got little experience in working within democratic institutions, and in many cases it means that they lack the skills to deal effectively with opposition, to build and sustain political coalitions, to succeed in the give and take of legislative politics. And many of them lack the patience for it as well. There's a quote by a former advisor of Fujimori who said that Fujimori used to hate it every time he had to invite the president of the Senate to have lunch when he passed a bill when he wanted to pass a bill in Congress. Well, you know, that's what you do in a democracy. Now, some outsiders turn out to be Democrats, but many of the outsiders elected in Latin America over the last 30 years have not been Democrats. In fact, every single Latin American president who has closed down an elected Congress over the last 25 years has been an outsider. Fujimori, Serrano, Chavez, Correa. Even more important than that, even more than outsider status, though, is how populists get elected. This is really important. Populists are always elected in a context of deep public disaffection, discontento. Voters don't want to just throw out the incumbents. They want to throw the entire political establishment out. Populists campaign on a pledge to do away with the entire system, to bury what they depict as a corrupt, unrepresentative oligarchy. Now, sweeping away the entire political elite and its institutions is a pretty radical mandate. It's a pretty radical thing. But it's what these guys are elected to do. It's what they are elected to do. The problem, of course, is the old system is usually a representative democracy. The corrupt and unrepresentative institutions that populists promise to sweep away are things like legislatures, political parties, Supreme Courts. And in fact, when populists win the presidency, they very often find that the old political elite still controls these other institutions. The traditional parties may have a majority in Congress. Their appointees still sit on the Supreme Court. And in many cases, they're the ones that wrote the political rules of the game. For a political outsider who was elected on a pledge to do away with the old system, that creates a real incentive to assault those institutions, to try to close Congress, to pack the court, to rewrite the political rules of the game. If you were elected on a platform, on a pledge, to do away with the old political elite, to then sit down and negotiate with that elite, to then sit down and build coalitions with that elite like Lula did in Brazil, Lula's not a populist, to govern with that elite, that's a betrayal of your electoral mandate. To sit down and negotiate, build coalitions with that elite is a betrayal of your electoral mandate. And betraying your electoral mandate can be very politically costly. Ask Lucio Gutierrez. So populist presidents have a political incentive to assault democratic institutions. And that is a recipe for crisis. It's a recipe for a showdown between a popular president who has promised to sweep away corrupt, unrepresentative institutions and a political elite that views those very institutions as a last bastion of defense. Now, sometimes outsider presidents lose these showdowns. That happened in Guatemala with Jorge Serrano. It happened in Ecuador with Lucio Gutierrez. But they usually win for a couple of reasons. First of all, when a newly elected populist president takes on the old political elite, public opinion tends to overwhelmingly favor the president. We saw this in Fujimori's Peru. We saw this in Venezuela with Chavez. We saw this certainly with Ecuador under Correa. In each one of these cases, when the president began his assault on the old regime, he enjoyed 70 or 80% overwhelming public support in doing that. Big advantage to the president. Secondly, the opposition's lack of public support is reinforced by organizational weakness. In the aftermath of a populist victory, when an outsider wins the presidency, the opposition almost invariably is fragmented and weak. Populists only win elections when the established political parties, the partidos tradicionales, are in crisis. And after a populist victory, these traditional parties tend to be really discredited. Their support bases evaporate, and politicians abandon them in droves. No serious, self-respecting politician wants to be associated with the, with the traditional parties that have just been vanquished by a political outsider. I need about 5 more minutes. Okay. So the established parties fall apart, and as a result, opposition parties tend to be not only discredited, but also fragmented and organizationally weak, which makes it harder to mobilize against presidential abuse. Now, when a populist president prevails in these institutional crises, the result is usually a skewed playing field. With 70 or 80% public support, with a fragmented and discredited opposition, presidents can concentrate a lot of power. They can close Congress and elect a new one with a pro-presidential majority. They can pack the courts, they can pack the electoral authorities, they can pack other state institutions. They can rewrite electoral laws to weaken the established political parties. And in many cases, they can impose a new constitution that strengthens the executive vis-a-vis other branches of government and, of course, extends the presidential mandate. That is all a recipe for competitive authoritarianism. It's what happened in Argentina under Perón. It's what happened in Peru under Fujimori. It's what happened in Venezuela under Chavez. And it's what's happened in Ecuador under Correa. So populism has very double-edged consequences for democracy. It is clearly inclusionary, but it also almost invariably skews the playing field, which ultimately is undemocratic. Now, I want to close with a word about the state and then circle back to Ecuador. Populism, I think, is rooted in the combination of extreme social inequality and state weakness. And by state weakness, I mean the state's inability to carry out basic tasks: collecting taxes, building roads, implementing social programs, providing public security. When states are ineffective, when states don't work well, as is the case in most of the Andes, it's almost impossible for governments to govern well, no matter how honest they are, no matter how well-intentioned they are. When states can't tax, when they can't get bureaucrats to do what they want, when they can't even enforce the rule of law, even the best governments are not going to be able to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, to provide security, to protect consumers, to keep schools and hospitals supplied. And when governments consistently fail to deliver the goods, new democracies often get into trouble. Because rather than being served by the state, rather than being protected by the state, citizens start to feel either abandoned by the state or mistreated by the state. And that is a major source of public disaffection, of public anger. But, and this is crucial for populism, that disaffection is not distributed equally among members of society. In Latin America, state weakness always hits the poor much harder than it hits the rich. The rich can live with an ineffective state. They've got private schools, private doctors and hospitals. They've got private security guards, private lawyers to protect them. And when they've got friends in high places, when they've got problems to solve in the public bureaucracy. The poor have none of these options available. They're stuck with lousy public schools, lousy public health clinics and hospitals. They have no choice but to rely on inept, indifferent, sometimes corrupt bureaucrats. And they live in a world in which the police and the courts always seem to be working for somebody else, usually somebody with better connections and more money. In other words, the law, the very law, is viewed as being applied unevenly and unfairly. And it seems always to systematically benefit the wealthy and the well-connected. This is crucial. If the state cannot ensure that citizens in the highlands or in the shantytowns enjoy even the minimal rights and protections that are guaranteed to them by the Constitution, then citizens are going to start feeling like they're being treated unfairly by the state. And when this perception of unfairness persists over time from one government to a next government to a third government, citizens are going to start to believe that all the political parties are the same, that all politicians are corrupt and no good, that nobody in the political class represents them. It is those citizens who are most likely to vote for political outsiders who promise to throw everybody out. Que se vayan todos. Why do I say this? I think there are good reasons to be concerned about the future of democracy in Ecuador. Like most populists, Rafael Correa has concentrated way too much power. But unlike Chavez and Maduro, Correa is doing some things that may help get at some of the underlying causes of populism. He's reducing inequality, and crucially, he seems to be strengthening the state. A more effective state is critical to making democratic institutions work for all citizens in a society. So in fact, if the Correa government does leave behind a more effective state, it would make a huge long-term contribution to Ecuadorian democracy. It might even ensure, or help to ensure, that Correa's populist presidency is Ecuador's last. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now here, Professor Garay.
Thanks.
Do we need to?
Yeah, I need to pull up this.
You can
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
get out of your way.
Yeah, okay.
So that we can.
Okay, thanks. That's okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk about social policy in comparative perspective. I'm going to refer to a number of countries in Latin America. And specifically, I would like to focus on a sort of recent, a very significant phenomenon that has taken shape in South America and and Mexico over the past 2 to 3 decades, from the late 80s until the present time, which is the expansion of transfers and social services for populations that were traditionally excluded from social protection. So as you know, in Latin America, social policy was provided to workers with formal labor contracts, and social systems were organized as social security systems that excluded people who were outside the formal labor market. So we call those populations labor market outsiders, and they include the unemployed, rural workers, sort of street vendors, informal sector workers, and people hired off the books. And over sort of the 20th, since the mid-20th century, when most of these systems of social security were created, the proportion of the population that was excluded, like these outsiders, was a very large population. And I will show you in a minute what was the size of that population across countries. So these expansions are really significant phenomena that are also showing sort of the building of some state capacity, at least in the social policy field. These expansions have also transformed the incomplete or truncated shape of welfare programs in the region, and the main innovations have concentrated in the areas of old age pensions, cash transfers for families with children, and also in healthcare services. Although there's a broad variation in both in the timing of expansion across countries and also in the size of the programs that were created, there are a number of distinctive features of new social benefits for outsiders. And these new social benefits tend to have meaningful scope of coverage, so they reach a large proportion of the population. And one very important issue that deserves a lot of attention is that there's limited discretion in access to benefits and services. So unlike sort of traditional programs for the poor that tended to be more clientelistic or sort of that tended to manipulate beneficiaries or exchange benefits for support, these new programs that I'm talking about are sort of non-discretionary benefits. That doesn't mean that clientelism doesn't exist in these countries anymore, but that these large-scale programs are not clientelistic, and there's a real effort on the parts of governments to create more transparent and non-discretionary benefits. And we see also important positive social and economic effects as a result of the creation of these benefits. And this includes sort of studies have shown that infant mortality rates have declined, that there's an increase in school completion. Also, income inequality has gone down in several countries, such as in Ecuador or in Brazil, which it was one of the most unequal countries in the world, the most unequal country in Latin America, and has reversed that trend partly due to the expansion of these social programs. We also see income stability among the poorest households, which is a very important issue, that they are less vulnerable to shocks due to the fact that they receive some stable income out of these social benefits. And we also see growing economic activity in more backward areas. So, for example, the northeast of Brazil has witnessed an important increase in economic activity due to the expansion of rural pensions. So there are very important social and economic effects as a result of these benefits. So before I characterize sort of what is the structure and the scope of coverage of these different policies across countries, I would like to show you what is the percentage or the proportion of the excluded population or outsiders in the entire population. So these are data from 1990, 2000, and 2010. And we see that sort of the outsider population ranges from 40 to almost 80% of the population in different countries of South America and Mexico. That there are sort of countries in which the outsider population ranges from 40 to 50%, and that's Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. Then there's another group of countries, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. It's between 50 and less than 70% of the population. And then Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru had historically had a higher share of outsider population, around 80 and 70% of the population. And we see also an important decline in Ecuador in recent years in the size of the outsider population. And just to restate it, I mean the workers and their dependents who are not benefited by formal labor market protections. That's what the outsider population means. So We can also see that it has remained quite stable over time. So it hasn't changed dramatically between the 1990s and 2000s. And this is one of the big challenges that countries in Latin America face, how to create sort of better labor markets that include more people. So this is a population that is a target of the social protections that I will be talking about. So in the realm of pensions, we see sort of the expansion of non-contributory benefits for people 65 plus. We see different modes of expansion in Latin American countries. So governments had either created a universal pension program, that's the path followed by Bolivia, which created benefits for every person 65 plus, regardless of income. Then another mode of expansion has been the inclusion of outsiders in existing contributory programs. So the governments flexibilized rules and allowed people who didn't have past contributions due to the condition in the labor market to actually access contributory benefits. And another form of expansion has been the creation of a targeted pension program for outsiders. And in this latter category, we see most of the programs in the region have chosen that, whereas Brazil and Argentina have included outsiders in pre-existing pension structures. And when we look at the scope of coverage of these benefits, we see that some countries have really included a large share of the population. So Bolivia with its universal pension program, Argentina, Uruguay, that have more than 80% of the outsiders now protected with pensions. This is a huge expansion, means like millions of people are receiving benefits. Then Brazil and Ecuador have covered around 70% of the outsiders, which is also a very significant expansion. And we see a different path followed a bit by Chile, Mexico, and Peru with fewer, with a smaller scope of coverage. So there's tons of people who still remain unprotected in these other cases. So another area of expansion, which is the one that has received most attention and most of the studies have focused also, is that of the income transfers reaching households with children. So most of you may have heard about conditional cash transfers like Bolsa Familia or Oportunidades. In Ecuador, it's a Bono de Desarrollo Humano, which reaches, mothers with children. So this has been another important area of expansion, and we see that most countries have created conditional cash transfers, although there's some variation in whether transfers are conditional or not. And we see two modes of expansion, either the inclusion of outsider children into pre-existing programs for insiders, that is for formal sector workers, and so the expansion of existing family allowances, or the creation of a conditional cash transfer just for the outsiders. And that's more of what Ecuador has done with the Bono de Desarrollo Humano. And when looking at the scope of coverage of these programs, we see that there's also, again, a lot of variation, but the countries tend to follow similar paths. So we see that Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, which are the ones that had also higher coverage in pensions, are also covering more people with income transfers, and then Chile and Ecuador in a middle ground, and then Mexico and Peru with a smaller scope of coverage. And cash transfers reach a fewer portion of the outsider population everywhere. So it's not universal coverage as we've seen in pensions in some cases, but just here there's another sort of opportunity for greater expansion actually regarding cash transfers. And finally, health services have also been the focus of have received a lot of attention from governments in recent years. Health programs are way more complicated. They require, even if governments want to create a universal benefits, they need to develop infrastructure to reach the entire population. One of the features of Latin America is that health infrastructure typically is concentrated in cities or in large urban areas, and the rest of the country doesn't have enough infrastructure. So the creation or the expansion of health services requires a lot of state capacity and building that state capacity, which may take a long time. But we can look at two things. What's the payment system? Whether outsiders like these new beneficiaries are required to pay for their services, or whether services are partly subsidized, or whether they are free. And what's the current at this stage? How far have they reached in the protection of the outsiders? And again, we see that some countries have created systems that provide free services. That's Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And other countries have created systems that provide partly subsidized services. So the poorest outsiders get services for free, and the rest have to pay into the system. And that's Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. And finally, regarding the coverage, we see that it's broader, especially Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, that tended to have also broader services before these expansions happened. And other countries that are still sort of developing their infrastructure may end up creating broad coverage or not, depending on how far they go in their sort of initiative to build larger healthcare systems. So Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia have actually passed sort of or created initiatives that try to reach the entire population. They haven't achieved that yet. Whereas Mexico and Peru are more restrictive. They only reach a sector of the population. So having presented or characterized these different policy areas, what I would like to say very briefly is what could be the future social agenda regarding or ahead. And there are a number of issues that concern the development of institutions and other sort of policy areas that haven't received that much attention. So one of the issues that states face today is how to articulate the contributory and non-contributory components of the systems, especially regarding pensions, which are very complex systems. And there's a lot to learn from the experience of European countries. Now several Latin American countries have coverages that are comparable to those cases. So learning how to accommodate these different benefits is important. Another issue is how to better coordinate the provisioning of healthcare services, which is one of the biggest challenges in these expansions. So how to coordinate across levels of government issues of funding, quality of services, and oversight. And the experience of Brazil in this realm is a very important one. It has created great institutional structures that try to guarantee that everybody gets comparable services across the country. And studies show that healthcare services have been incredibly egalitarian. And after 20 years of the beginning of the expansion of health services, they have achieved great results in that respect. So that's a good case to look at. And then issues that remain to be addressed is housing policy. That's probably one of the areas in which Latin American governments still have a lot of work to do in developing housing infrastructure and creating national programs that actually address seriously that issue. And that's common across the cases. And finally, one of the big challenges is regards youth, how to generate policies that actually provide the appropriate or the right education, the skills formation, and that facilitate access to jobs, partly also to revert this sort of structure of the labor market that is so segmented between insiders and outsiders. So that's one of the issues that I think governments will have to focus more clearly in the coming years, having achieved a lot of sort of success in the protection of children and seniors. Now these are issues ahead. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our two expositors. Now, so we have like 10 minutes for questions. I'll start with that question, and then I'll give the floor to whoever of you would like to ask. So, Professor Levitsky touched in a very interesting tension between, in the case of competitive authoritarianism, and it is, well, you have, on one hand, weakened democracies, but by making the government more effective, you could be actually paving the ground for a future more democratic set of institutions. My question goes towards where do the costs become too much? And I'm thinking of a bunch of historical examples. I don't know if you would classify the Third Reich as a process of emergence that emerges through competitive authoritarianism, in the sense that they come through elections and they sort of changed the playing field and became a fully authoritarian regime. And in their time, they were recognized for making the government very effective. And indeed, they guaranteed that a regime such like themselves never happened again. But at what cost? In a less extreme case, although they are not exactly comparative authoritarian cases, but think of the cases of the government of Pinochet in Chile or the government of Castro in Cuba. Although their genesis was very different, they both have been praised for making some elements of the state more effective. Education, health in the case of Cuba, economic, in general, private investment in the case of Chile. And in the case of Chile, certainly seems to have created conditions for democracy in a way, but it came at a cost. So my question is, what is too much of a cost? Where do you, in the balance of cost and payments, how do we think about drawing a line? And how far from that line do you think Ecuador currently is?
Oof.
I was going to ask the same, so thanks everyone.
Good Lord. Can I at least have time to think about that one? Are you going to collect questions, or should I, I guess you want me to answer, don't you? Yeah. Boy. Couple of things. I mean, first of all, ultimately, that is a normative question that depends on one's commitment to liberal democratic principles. I personally am pretty strongly committed to liberal democratic principles, so I tend to draw the line very very close, in the sense that I'm not one to accept authoritarianism in the name of some other good, whether it's Pinochet or Castro. I prefer to go a more liberal democratic route. Now, there is some empirical basis to that normative claim, which is that although it's easy to find authoritarian regimes that you can make an argument were more effective than their predecessor, whether it's South Korea or Taiwan or Pinochet, although there are debates about Pinochet. In general, authoritarian regimes are all over the board. And many, if not most authoritarian regimes are actually disasters in terms of policy, in terms of institution building, in terms of state building. So yes, there are clear cases of authoritarian regimes that have left behind better functioning states. The vast majority have left behind disasters. They've not only been a normative disaster, but they've been a policy disaster. So for every Pinochet, there are many Videlas. And that's true of competitive authoritarian regimes as well. I mentioned that I don't know the Ecuadorian case very well, but that Correa does seem to be doing a number of things in terms of improving policy and improving the performance of the state. And similar arguments were made about Fujimori in Peru, at least in some areas. But there are other competitive authoritarian regimes, and I would point to Venezuela, that are disasters, that are going to leave behind much weaker states than they inherited. So it's very difficult to generalize. But if you look across the board at the empirical record, authoritarian regimes have not performed better economically. They have not brought greater social justice than have democracies. So there's some empirical reason to support a normative position in favor of liberal democracy.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes.
This question is for Professor Levitsky. I'm Esteban Lubensky from Ecuador. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT.
Can you address the importance of limitations to re-election, first in a broad sense, and second in the specific scenario of competitive authoritarianism? And then following from one of the points that you made, actually to close out your presentation, could a case be made today in Ecuador that re-election, an extension to re-election, could be justified precisely to ensure that some of the positive changes that Correa's government is pushing through are reaffirmed, and we get that stronger state that can prevent or eliminate the need of a future populist government?
Look, extensions to re-election can always be justified in the name of some other, broader good. In fact, historically, they always have been. Porfirio Diaz extended his re-election in the name of progress as well. And that ultimately is a normative decision on it. I'm not in a position to speak for Ecuadorians about whether that, extending re-election in the name of state building or whatever is a worthwhile trade-off. That's the decision ultimately of Ecuadorians to make. I don't live there. But keep in mind, first of all, that this would not be the first time that an argument is made to justify changing the Constitution again, to re-elect the president again because we really need it and it's really doing some good. This has been done over and over and over again in Latin American history. And Democrats in Latin America have always opposed re-election really staunchly for good historical reasons, because most dictators in Latin American history have perpetuated their power through re-election. So 25 years ago, there was a near unanimity among Latin American Democrats that re-election had to be opposed under all circumstances at all costs, because in Latin America, because Latin American states are, for the most part, fairly easy to politicize. It's pretty easy to use state institutions and state resources. There are variation across countries, but pretty easy to use state resources to benefit the incumbent. That allowing re-election was just too dangerous. It would create too much of an incumbent advantage. And so the best thing to do was to prevent re-election at all costs. Now that has costs. It has cost in terms of democracy. Sometimes people want to vote for incumbents again, and for the reasons that you point out, that sometimes governments are doing good things and it takes a while to implement policies. So 8 years or 10 years may be preferable to 4 or 5 years. And so that debate surged in Latin America in the 1990s, and we saw the constitutional change in a number of countries. And I think we've seen diverse outcomes. In countries where democratic institutions are strong, and I would include Brazil and Argentina and Colombia, 2 terms in the presidency is fine. It's not a big deal, because there's not that much abuse of incumbent power. Where democratic institutions are weaker, it's much more dangerous. Peru, Venezuela, and the same old problem of incumbents abusing state resources so that you get too much of an incumbent advantage, is that danger remains pretty serious in, I would say, most of the Andes in Central America. You know, and it's also a joke institutionally to change the Constitution twice. I mean, one time, okay, but again, really? I mean, I think that undermines the seriousness of the Constitution that you're putting forward, and it has an institutional weakening, an institutional cheapening effect. But again, that's a debate that Ecuadorians have to have.
Thank you. Any other question? One, Ambassador, please. One last question, and there we go.
A less controversial question, not for Steven, but for Candelaria. When you were talking about the increase of the plus 65 that were already excluded, that were in the past excluded, were you taking in consideration only transfers, cash transfers outside the security system, right?
Right,
okay.
Outside the social security system. So it's the people who would have never made a social security pension. So out of that population, like, that's the percentage that receives the new pension. So in Ecuador, it's about 75%.
Yeah, because I was impressed about the number. I don't know if the minister later.
It's higher than that.
Yes.
But including cash transfers to
And
people.
everything, yes. Including everything, right, Minister?
So
yeah.
This is 2010. So the data I have is for 2010, when the program began, when the expansion, I think, in Ecuador became more relevant.
No, I was impressed with how large the number
Oh,
was.
how large the
number was.
Yeah.
So I was wondering.
Well, in Ecuador, if I'm not wrong, it's about 580,000 people who are receiving out of a population of less than 1 million people 65 plus.
So when they're receiving, is that when you're taking in consideration? Doesn't matter the amount that they're receiving. Just about, it's yes or no.
Exactly.
Okay. Then,
exactly.
then it's correct. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just the final question, please.
Great presentation, Steve. I'm Nelson Cron, a professor at NC State University. What do you think about when a lot of people, when you say it is a popular president or a populist president, normally that's a way to undermine a lot of the achievements and everything. And that's why you see a lot in the press. When they call him, oh, this is a populist, that's already kind of a sense to diminish what the person is and the movement is. So what are your thoughts and how people perceive that? Because they think that the elite of the politicians, there are different type of maybe persons
Yeah.
or so?
No, that's a great question, and I recognize that populist is is very often used in a pejorative, negative sense. Certainly in the United States, it's also defined in lots of different ways. Here in the United States, it's very frequently associated with, say, statist or redistributive economic policies. People, if you're sort of more left of center, more statist in your economic policy, you're populist. That's not how I use the term. So even social scientists have very different uses of the term, but you're right. In the media, in policy circles, certainly in the United States, but also in Latin America, the term populist is thrown about in a very negative way. That's not how I'm using it. I'm using it as an analytic term, as a social science term, and I'm in effective, neutral is probably not the right word, but I'm not, in fact, my point is that it has both positive and negative effects for democracy. So I understand that it's a politically loaded term, but that's not how I'm using it. I'm not using it in the sort of standard U.S. establishment negative way.
Great. Thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience. So I think we have a coffee break right now.
So I invite you to a coffee break outside. We have 10 minutes and enjoy more discussions over there.